Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company. You know them. I've talked about them a lot. They're my primary sponsor of this podcast. I've produced 2 courses for them on skepticism and conspiracy theories, in case you're interested. But they have a lot more now. It's a subscription service. You go to wondrium.com, and if you do that through this podcast /Shermer, that is wondrium.com/Shermer, you get 2 years for the price of 1. This is an incredible deal. I mean, you get a year of free stuff, and we're talking thousands of items, content that they have produced or distributed or purchased for the platform, and it's just endless, really. Short form videos, long form courses, tutorials, how-to lessons, travel logs, documentaries, and more. Here's one that just popped up on my app that I'll probably check out here this week. Understanding Russia. I think that's kind of important these days. This is 24 lectures at 30 minutes a lecture. Russia past the Putin future. Yeah. Ivan the Terrible, a 500-year reign of terror. That's how he got the name, appellation, terrible. Peter the Great, Russia's northern window on Europe, nobility, the Tsar, and the peasant. That brings us up into the 19th century. Catherine the Great and the Enlightenment. Yeah, it's good that they went through the Enlightenment. Alexander Pushkin's Russia, so we're going to get into literary Russia there, which is a lot. Russia fin de siècle, that is the end of the 19th century. And that probably takes us into, yes, it does, the rise and fall of the Romanovs, the Russian Revolution, the assassination of the royal family, the Romanovs, and then up into Lenin, Stalin, the Soviets, Great Patriotic War. That's what they call World War II, the Great Patriotic War. When you go to Moscow, which I have, there's a massive World War II museum. We would call it a World War II museum. They call it this great war, that patriotic war in which they liberated Europe. They saved the West from the Nazis. Anyway, that's their take. Of course, that takes us into the Cold War with Khrushchev. I presume they'll be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is super interesting and important. And then all the way up into the modern era here, 21st century, Soviet chaos and Russian revenge. That seems to be what we're going through now. Anyway, check out that course and all the others. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/SHERMER. 2 years for the price of 1. Check it out. Thanks for listening. Here's our episode. All right. My guest today is Naomi Oreskes, who is a professor of the history of science at Harvard University. Her opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many other outlets. Her TED Talk, Why We Should Trust Scientists, was viewed more than 1 million times. Her co-author of the new book, and here's the new book, by the way, it's called The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. I'll say. Her co-author is Erik M. Conway, is also a historian of science and technology and works for the California Institute of Technology. And he is himself the author of 7 books and dozens of articles and essays. So we'll be talking with just Naomi this morning on the new book. So that said, Naomi, welcome to the show. What do you mean by myth? What is a myth? Let's start
I'd
there.
say, yeah, that's a great place to start. I'd say a myth is something people believe in that's not supported by the facts. That if you try to look closely at it, you find that it's an article of faith. It's something that people have been raised with, something that people take for granted, don't question. But if you really dig in, you find either it's not evidence-based or actually there is evidence that goes against it. And in our book, we argue that there's lots of evidence that goes against the idea that the free market can solve all our problems.
Right. Okay, let's just hover on that for a second, because myth, yeah, I generally tend to use it that way as well when we're talking about like creationism or religious myths. But, you know, there's a second sense in which, let's just channel our inner Jordan Peterson or Joseph Campbell and think, well, myths tell stories that have a kind of truth, not an empirical truth so much that can be proved or disproved, but it tells a story that, I don't know, gives our lives meaning or direction or goals or purposes, something like that. Whether it's true or not is maybe beside the point. And so some of the points you make in the book, I think, are hit that as well. right? I mean, it's a story about free markets that people tell themselves it feels good. We believe in freedom. And freedom in markets is no different from freedom in politics. I believe in freedom in politics. It gives my life direction and meaning and purpose. So whether it's true or not, maybe has a secondary purpose.
Well, sure. And, I've read enough Joseph Campbell to agree with the argument that not all myths are bad, that myths can serve useful cultural purposes, but they can also be damaging. And so our argument in this book is that this particular myth is untrue. It's not supported by the evidence of history or the evidence of economics, and it's damaging, that it's been very, very damaging.
Okay, so what is the myth? Market fundamentalism.
The myth is what we call free market fundamentalism, and it has a few components. So we struggled actually with kind of coming up with a really pithy, slogan. But basically, it's the idea that there is a thing called the free market. So the first part of the myth is even the idea of the free market. We argue that's a myth because there's no such thing as the free market. Markets are human institutions, just like schools, religion, marriage, universities, whatever. We create markets and we create rules and regulations by which those markets operate. So markets have been around as long as civilization has existed. If you read the Bible, you see there are rules and regulations put forward for how markets should operate in Leviticus. We know that there were rules for the operation of markets in ancient civilizations in medieval Europe. So the idea that there is even such a thing as the free market is itself a foundational part of the myth. And so we argue that, yes, markets are good and important. Markets do a lot of useful things, but the idea that there even could be a free market is a myth. The second part of the myth, then, is that this so-called free market has wisdom. It exists independently of us. And if we just leave it alone and get government out of the way, the market will be efficient and will solve most of our problems. And we don't need government. And this is the third part of the myth. The third part is that government actually interferes, that government is a sort of encroachment on the wisdom of the marketplace. And therefore, we should, as much as possible, minimize government involvement in the marketplace. We think all three parts of that myth are false.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's well put, perfectly put. And I would say your book accurately describes what people believe about that myth. As you described me as a recovered libertarian in your book.
I had fun with that.
I read all this stuff. So I just filled a box from my personal library at home. These are just books and authors who you discuss in your book. All right, here we go. Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. F.A. Hayek, The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism. And then Ludwig von Mises' book, Socialism. The Myth of the Robber Barons. This is, I include, you don't discuss this, but I include this because it's published by Young Americans Foundation, which I believe is the same group now that funds Ben Shapiro and other conservatives that go on college campuses. Here's one, Ludwig von Mises, Planned Chaos. This one's published, after I read your book, I realized I should look who actually publishes these things. And this one's called the Foundation for Economic Education. That's FEE. That's Leonard Reed's organization, and that you also discuss. And I think this one's the same one, the Anti-Capitalist Mentality, Ludwig von Mises. Yeah, let's see who publishes this one. Oh, yeah, Libertarian Press, right? So, and then of course, the great Human Action. It's almost as thick as your book, a treatise on economics. F.A. Hayek, The Constitution of Liberty. Let me see who published. Oh, this is the University of Chicago Press. So we'll get into that. You have a long discussion of how they kind of got into promoting the myth. And of course, no library would be complete without Atlas Shrugged. Actually thicker than your book by Ayn Rand. There she is.
Yeah.
All right. So for sure, people believe everything that the way you summarize the myth. Yes, this is, and there's a vast literature. There's tons of think tanks that promote this. So one question I had is, why there's all these libertarian and conservative think tanks, Reason Magazine, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute, there's dozens of them. Where are the liberal counterparts to those think tanks? Are there such a thing?
Well, there are some, but not nearly as many. And that's part of our story, because part of the story is the way business leaders starting mostly in the 1930s and then accelerating towards the 1970s and 80s, made a conscious decision to create organizations to promote the big myth. And so one of them is the one that you mentioned, the Foundation for Economic Education, which was first headed by a man named Leonard Read. And it was created consciously and deliberately as an organization to promote free market thinking, to promote pro-market anti-government ideology. And its backers read like a kind of who's who of American captains of industry. So names like DuPont, Sloan Kettering, J. Howard Pugh of the Sun Oil Company. So, and I love the fact you have all these books, for one thing, because actually a lot of people, I mean, part of the story was to explain where these ideas came from and who was it who was promoting it. A lot of people have no idea. You do, which is great. And it's great you have all those books. And as you were suggesting, one of the key things is that with a few notable exceptions, mostly Friedrich von Hayek, these books are not published by academic presses. They do not go through peer review. Because if they did, most of them would be rejected because many of them make claims that are either unsupported by evidence, and we can talk about Hayek at the University of Chicago. There's a good story about that in the book. Or they're clearly false. They're clearly refuted by the facts of history. So very few reputable academic presses would even consider these books. So this is why we argue that a lot of this is propaganda, that it's ideological, that people are promoting these views for ideological and political purposes. These business leaders are funneling huge amounts of money into these organizations, so that by the 1970s and 80s, there are so many of them that they have to have an organization to organize the organizations. And that's the Atlas Network. And of course, the name is drawn from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah. Well, and then every summer I go to Freedom Fest, which is Mark Skousen's organization that hosts all these speakers, generally along these lines. They have quite a variety. They're always looking for critics, so you should come.
Okay.
Now, in your previous book, The Emergence of Doubt, you show that tobacco companies knew that tobacco was cancer-causing, and they covered it up. They lied. Why? To make money. It's just a pure profit motive. I think this might be a little different. I think the people who promote free market fundamentalism, they actually believe it. They're not just thinking, well, I just want to make more money, so we're gonna sell the general public on this bullshit myth story that none of us actually believe. They really believe it.
Well, that's right. And I think there's sort of a couple of different elements to that. And to some extent, this was in the Merchants of Doubt story as well. In fact, that's how we got interested in this problem. So you're right. The tobacco industry is mostly just venal. I mean, a lot of what they did was actually criminal, and it was about keeping a deadly product on the market for as long as possible to make as much money as possible. And there's not much you can do to defend or justify or rationalize what those folks did. But what we showed in Merchants of Doubt was that they weren't the only one. And we were particularly interested, Erik, Conway, and I were particularly interested in the scientists who made common cause with the tobacco industry. So why would a scientist go to work for such a venal industry? Now, one obvious answer would be money, that they were shills, that they were paid off. But we found that the evidence did not actually support that. And actually, most of the people we studied, we found very little evidence that they had personally profited. I mean, some of them had, but many of them hadn't. So why would they do this? So there's an ideological motivation, and the ideological motivation comes out of market fundamentalism. The idea that if you allow the government to compromise economic freedom, you're on the slippery slope to the loss of political freedom. And I think the people we studied, at least some of them, I think authentically believe that. And it was connected to their work in the Cold War defending America and containing communism. So they saw that work as of a piece with the work that they had done building the atomic bomb, building the hydrogen bomb, etc. So we wanted to know more about that. Where did that ideology come from? Because these were highly intelligent people. We couldn't just say, oh, they're idiots. Because Fred Seitz was a president of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's not remotely plausible that he's just stupid, right? So we started digging more into this ideology. And in some ways, it's a similar story. It's kind of a mix of venal motivations with authentic questions, real questions. So I think the real question here, the legitimate question, and where I have sympathy for, the people you probably hang out with at Freedom Fest, there's a really important question at the root of all of this, which is, what is the role of government? And how do we balance the need for government to protect the common good, to build roads and bridges, maybe to build schools and hospitals that are not done efficiently by the private sector, versus the rights of business people to run their business as they see fit, versus the rights of workers not to be exploited, versus the rights of children to have a childhood and not be sent to work in factories. I mean, this is the fundamental question of what government is, what society is. These are questions that people have been arguing about going back to Plato. And that's a really legitimate question. And so you can see how many people would be drawn into the argument that, well, we want, and also I should say, and it draws on legitimate values, right? We all believe in freedom, right? I don't know anyone who would say, no, I think the government should take away my freedom. No one is saying that. So it's drawing on important questions about freedom, about individual liberty, and about how we deal with competing interests in a democratic society. All fair and good questions. The problem is that certain business leaders, who we focus on this book, exploit that. They are trying to protect their profits in a way that's not that different from tobacco. They don't want bans on child labor. They do not want an 8-hour day. They do not want workmen's compensation because they see these things as threatening both their profits and their prerogatives as business owners. And so they begin to construct this story that draws on values that we all cherish, like freedom, and to construct a story that is sadly mostly propaganda. And we even have, there's a great place in the book where we talk about the National Association of Manufacturers, where one of the staff who's working on this propaganda program says, we're not really breaking through because honestly, we're not really credible as defenders of the interests of the American people. And this is during the Great Depression, when American capitalism has failed spectacularly, and it's not irrational to think that the government might need to do something. And so they come up with this idea of the tripod of freedom to make the claim that economic liberty, or what they call free enterprise, previously had been called private enterprise. They decide, that's not a good term. Let's change it to free enterprise, so that free enterprise is part of a tripod of freedom, along with representative democracy and the rights that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights. And their argument is that if we allow the government to compromise economic freedom, the whole tripod will fall. Now, maybe there's something to that. I mean, obviously, there might be some limits that we want to impose on the rights of the government to dictate how organizations, private sector organizations run. I mean, this is where this gets tied in with Ludwig von Mises and arguments about communism and socialism. But the idea of a tripod of freedom is a complete invention. It's a complete fabrication. Free enterprise is not in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Bill of Rights. And in fact, if you look at the history of 19th century America, you see massive amounts of government involvement in the economy. So the idea that the New Deal is somehow a departure, well, it is a departure in certain ways. There's certainly the scale and the degree of government involvement, but the scale and degree of economic collapse in the Great Depression was unprecedented too. So it's really a misrepresentation of history. And that's, again, why we come back to saying it's a myth. They're creating a story that's not actually supported by the facts of history in order to protect their own self-interests. But they do it by building an ideological edifice that includes legitimate questions. And so that's partly how it gains credibility. And of course, another big part of it is then recruiting academics.
Mm-hmm. Right. So often I think ideology trumps rationality or intelligence or whatever, in the sense that like some of Dan Kahan's research on how people reason about problems, like his famous experiment with gun control. And he gives subjects a table of numbers, and it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. Cities that have gun control, cities that don't have gun control, crime goes up, crime goes down. And numerate people are better able to kind of quickly make a ratio calculation in their head and see, well, it looks like gun control works, or it looks like gun control doesn't work. He just made up the numbers. It doesn't matter. It's just, but he shows that Republicans are better at doing the calculations when it looks like the ratios support no gun control, and Democrats are better at making the calculation when it does support gun control, right? So, yeah, to your point about intelligent scientists, yeah, it's almost secondary to the deeper thing. And so, if anything, intelligent, rational people are better able to rationalize what they want to be true for some other reason. And I do think this goes a long way to explain it. Like, remember that book, What Happened to Kansas? people are not voting their self-interests. You would think they would selfishly vote for whichever party is going to give them what they want for their personal lives, but they don't. Sometimes faith and flag and family, to use the 3 F's of the Republicans, trump, whatever it is that, well, they're going to raise taxes on you. They're going to lower taxes on their rich buddies, right? I don't care. I believe in faith and flag and family and whatever. And so I think sometimes that happens as well.
Well, yeah, of course. And I think we all know that motivated reasoning is a real thing. Dan Cahan has written about it, Steven Pinker, and many others. And we all know that everyone can potentially succumb to it. But on the other hand, and I don't want to be fetishistic about science. I mean, you know me well enough to know that I believe in the value of science, but I also don't think it trumps all other considerations at all times. But I think it's also important to recognize that people don't always succumb to motivated reasoning. And if you think about the merchants of doubt, they're an interesting story in part because they're exceptions. The vast majority of the scientific community does accept that tobacco is a deadly product, and doctors, oncologists, public health officials begin to speak out against tobacco. And that's why the tobacco industry launches a propaganda campaign to defend themselves against the facts. The original title we had for the book was Fighting Facts. And I still think of it in those terms. In fact, I have a course I'm about to teach called Burning Books, Fighting Facts.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, and if you think about climate change, it's the same thing. The vast majority of scientists will say, yes, we know that man-made climate change is happening. It's doing damage. It's making extreme weather events worse, making the climate system more unstable. They're going by the evidence, but we have climate change deniers and other people. And so then one of the questions becomes, why are some people more influenced by ideology than others? And I think that's where our story comes in, because we're not just being presented with the facts and given the opportunity to assess them. We're being bombarded by commercials, by marketing, by advertising. And the story we tell is about the bombardment of the American people from a lot of different angles and in a lot of different ways with this free market fundamentalist story. So it's not a level playing field. And I think this is a key part of the story. And just to add one little detail, I was looking at some information the other day about how people feel about estate taxes, what's so-called death tax, right? And it turns out most Americans, if you just ask them, how do you feel about the death tax? They say, oh, no, I hate it. But if you sit down with them and explain to them, who does it affect? It turns out actually most of them support it, because the fear is that they will be affected by it and that things they'd like to leave to their children and grandchildren will be taken away from them. The reality is that the estate tax only affects a very, very tiny portion of extraordinarily wealthy people. And when people have that information given to them, turns out most people do support the estate tax.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. Like the research asking people what they think about NAFTA, and they're, I'm for it or I'm against it. Well, what is it? Right. I don't know.
Right. There was that, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel did that great thing with it, like the man on the street thing, and asked people, do you support the Affordable Health Care? Do you support Obamacare? No. Do you support the Affordable Health Care Act? Yes. So how you tell the story really matters. And that's really the argument of this book.
I think one of those was, keep your government hands off my Medicare. It's like,
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to the beginning. There's nothing in the Constitution outlining what kind of economic system we have. So we ended up with something like a regulated market economy. And the same year that we declared our independence, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. I think most people don't read it. I mean, it's a massive book. It's difficult. It's written in that late 18th century paragraph long sentences, therefore, furthermore, and moreover, and your eyes kind of glaze over.
Tons of semicolons.
And he goes off on banking and this and that. It's like, you kind of skip to the good parts, right? And I think that's what most people do. So what did he think, and how did that get revised in your story?
So this is a really important part of the story, and I think what you said is exactly right. I suspect the vast majority of people have never read The Wealth of Nations, and honestly, I hadn't read it until we wrote this book, and then I spent a month with that book. So you said something important. You said he goes off on banking regulation, but this is the point. He's not going off on banking regulation. Adam Smith is trying to build a vision of a capitalist society that would work well for everyone. And he's contrasting it to the mercantilism that has dominated European societies up until then. So he has been constructed in the minds of many market fundamentalists, and I would say even the minds of many editors at the Wall Street Journal, if I may say that, as a kind of market fundamentalist, as a, let's say, a defender of laissez-faire capitalism who just thinks, let the market do its magic and everything will be great. That is a misrepresentation. If you actually read the book, you see that actually Adam Smith has a lot of caveats. And one of the caveats is about the need to regulate banks. And he has a long discussion, which frankly, everybody should read after 2008, about how if you don't regulate banks, it threatens the entire security of the economic system, and that irresponsible bankers can bring the whole system down. And so he's absolutely clear about the idea that banks need to be regulated. So then the question comes up, well, what else? And there's an absolutely fascinating discussion where he talks about the idea of a firewall. He says, well, why do we have firewalls? Because if a fire breaks out in my house, it could spread to your house and hurt you. And so therefore, it's reasonable to require fire laws. And so this is the principle he puts forward. We have to ask the question, does my action put you at risk? And if it does, then it might be legitimate to limit it. And that's a staggering thing to read for anyone who has the idea that Adam Smith is an advocate of complete laissez-faire. So then the question becomes, and I should say, and that's not the only thing, he has a discussion of the need for adequate wages for workers. He even has a discussion that's a sort of defense of proto-unionism that says workers actually do need to collaborate and work together because they have less power than the owners. He has a discussion of the need for taxation to build roads and bridges. He does not think taxation is wrong or that it's theft. So, I mean, it's a very different image or a very different reality than what the image of Adam Smith is that many of us have held. So then the question becomes, why do we have this image of Smith as a radical free market fundamentalist when he clearly is not? And part of the answer to that is in our story, because we show that after World War II, the same industrialists who we've been discussing realized that their arguments are not actually taking hold because they lack credibility, because people see through it. They see that it's self-interested. And so they begin to recruit academics to help them build their case. And they give money to the University of Chicago to create something called the Free Market Project. And the Free Market Project is a complicated thing, lots of interesting people beyond the scope of what we were able to cover adequately in the book. But one of the people who's hired as part of this is the economist George Stigler, who is famous for his arguments against government regulation and arguments about regulatory capture. And again, some of, like all good myths have a kernel of truth, right? To get back to where we started. So some of what Stigler said about regulatory capture is absolutely correct. And regulatory capture is something that one has to worry about. But he makes it an argument for not having regulation, which is a little weird in my opinion. But the important point for our story here is that Stigler produces an edited, very, very heavily edited version of The Wealth of Nations, which is published by a mainstream press. And we had a little trouble getting good details on how many copies were sold, but there's at least circumstantial evidence that this was widely used in teaching, economics teaching, because, as you said, The Wealth of Nations is a book that's almost impossible to read, certainly not something you could assign to undergraduates. So he produces this slim version, and all of Adam Smith's caveats are expunged. The whole discussion of banking regulation, gone. The whole discussion of the need for taxes, gone. All of the things that make Smith into the nuanced, sophisticated thinker that he actually was are eliminated from the University of Chicago version.
Yeah, interesting. Let me just read a few sections from my book, The Mind of the Market, which I talk about Adam Smith in this way. Like he says, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. Like, wait, Adam Smith wrote that?
Exactly.
And he says, we are not ready to suspect any person of being defected in selfishness, and warning that all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. So you have to read A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which you also discuss, and I assume you've read that as well.
Yeah, right.
That's a much more readable book.
It is.
In which he's clearly not just saying selfish. He's not Gordon Gekko saying simply greed is good.
Correct. But that's what he was made into, right, in the 70s and 80s by some of the extreme advocates of market fundamentalism.
Yeah. couple other things here that I rather enjoyed reading about Adam Smith. Let's see. Of course, his famous line, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." So that's what often gets quoted, because that's sort of that, well, we should just appeal to people's selfish motives, but that's in a much larger context.
Exactly. That's one sentence out of a 1,000-page book.
Right. Yeah. So, on this subject of kind of individualism and selfishness, and in the moral sentiments, he talks about, well, we are selfish and greedy and so on, but you also have this other line of sentiments of empathy. I think he used the word empathy rather than sympathy, caring for other people, the ability to, kind of in interchangeable perspectives, put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine how we would feel if this happened, the golden rule, and so on. People don't know that about Adam Smith as well. So if you're going to structure a society, the other thing I was going to point, what the name of his book, The Nature and Cause, it's often called The Wealth of Nations, but it's really on the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. What is it? Right? So who's he writing against? The mercantilists you mentioned. And that was a producer-oriented rather than a consumer-oriented market system. And so if anything, Adam Smith is saying that the wealth is in the people, all of the people,
right?
Not just the powerful people, the rich people, the government people, and so on.
And I think also, if I can add to that, I think it's really important to think about Smith as the Enlightenment thinker that he was, right? He's writing right in the heart of the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson is reading him. And as you said, it's an inquiry into the origins and causes of the wealth of nation. Like all Enlightenment philosophers, he wants to make the world a better place. He's not the Gordon Gekko cynic, right? Who's just like, eat every man for himself and, to hell with everyone else. No, it's about how do we make a better society where we can generate wealth and share it and make things better for all. And again, that notion of empathy, that notion of the empathetic motivation is lost in many of the presentations of Adam Smith that we've come to know in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
Yeah, here's that quote I found here. "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner."
Exactly.
Yeah, that was 1759 he published. He really only wrote 2 books. The other thing about conservatives, modern conservatives, on this Adam Smith and against mercantilism, producer oriented rather than consumer oriented. So here's Smith writes, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer." And then I shifted talking about Ronald Reagan. In 1982, Harley-Davidson Motor Company was struggling to compete against Japanese motorcycle manufacturers that were producing higher quality bikes at lower prices. Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Suzuki were routinely undercutting Harley-Davidson by $1,500 to $2,000 a bike. I remember because I bought a Honda 125. A true defender of free market economics would have cheered the spectacular savings to American consumers. After all, what difference does it make to consumers who produces the products they want? But on January 19th, 1983, the International Trade Commission ruled that foreign motorcycle imports were a threat to domestic motorcycle manufacturers, and a 2-to-1 finding of injury was ruled on petition by Harley-Davidson, which complained that it could not compete with foreign motorcycle producers. And on April 1st, Reagan approved the ITC recommendation, explaining to Congress, quote, "I have determined that import relief in this case is consistent with our national economic interest." What?
Exactly. Right. And I think that's a great example, because without taking a position about whether that particular decision was right or wrong, it speaks to the fact that we're always balancing competing interests. The consumer does want to buy a good motorcycle at a lower price, but we also have a national interest in protecting the jobs of workers, right? Particularly, if there's a very short-term disruption that could really disrupt communities. So, and the same issue comes up again with the debates over NAFTA, which we discuss in the book. There were definitely some benefits to NAFTA. There's no question that there are benefits to global trade. I use this example in my class with my students. I said, look, imagine I'm French and I produce great wines, and you're German and you produce great cars. It's in our interest to trade, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, the basic notion of trade is a good one, but there are other considerations as well. And that's what market fundamentalism leaves out of the story.
Right. So even Reagan had to adjust his, well, at least his public face.
Right. And some of the market fundamentalists, to their credit, did criticize Reagan for that. Right. But
did,
I mean, and, people are inconsistent, and that's okay. But the other sort of irony of this story, so a major player in this story are the National Association of Manufacturers, who we track fighting child labor laws, fighting workmen's compensation, and by the way, even today, fighting climate action. They opposed the Inflation Reduction Act. They've been fighting the Securities and Exchange Commission today over disclosures about conflict minerals. So, I mean, they're in this story from the beginning to the end. But one of the ironies is if you ask yourself, well, why were they created in the first place? They were created in the late 19th century to demand protective tariffs for American manufacturers.
Right. That's not free market.
No. So you see a lot of inconsistencies. These folks want government when it helps them, but they don't want government when they see it as competing with their own self-interest.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now it's called crony capitalism, right?
There's a lot of that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember when the Automobile Dealers Association, I think they're called, were upset that Elon was selling Teslas just on his own, right? Just,
right.
hey,
Not
wait a minute.
dealers.
No, you can't do this. And, they go to Congress like, how is this free? I thought you guys were capitalists.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right, let's go back to what's the problem to be solved here? Okay. So you take us back to the late 19th century and all the, mining accidents and railroad accidents and, what was it, Blake's, the dark satanic mills.
Right.
Yeah. What was life like for children, workers, the average person, a century and a half ago?
Terrible, absolutely terrible. And this is why we start the book with the social costs of capitalism, because I think a lot of people today have forgotten how bad things were before all of the reforms of the 20th century. So in the late 19th century, huge numbers of workers were injured or killed on the job every year. It was so bad that it had a name. It was called the accident crisis. There's a statistic we use right at the beginning of the book, which I just think is staggering. If you were a young man born in the year 1900, 15, 16 years later, you would have been safer enlisting to fight in World War I than going to work on the railroads.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It's staggering.
So, I know. So it was a kind of industrial warfare in which the soldiers were workers, and huge numbers were killed or injured and, disabled, unable to work. And when that happened, I mean, nowadays we take it for granted that we have disability insurance, workmen's compensation. If a man is injured on the job, and I'm using the word man deliberately here, we don't expect his wife and children to starve to death or to be thrown on the mercy of private charity or the mercy of relatives who may or may not have been able to take them in. But that was the case in the early 20th century. And an interesting part of this story, so a debate breaks out about what to do about this crisis. And it's viewed as a crisis by the people who are talking about it. And one of the things that they notice is that accident rates are much lower in Germany and the United Kingdom, which are the two other highly industrialized societies at this time. So people, including some what I'd like to call enlightened industrialists, people like Andrew Carnegie, a lot of industrial engineers, the field of industrial engineering is developing at this very time. The industrial engineers are particularly, sort of ironic because they don't like this. They don't talk about it in terms of the pain and suffering of the people. They talk about it as the inefficiencies that you're wasting workers. But okay, whatever. Everyone's got their own framing. So they go to Europe to try to understand why accident rates are lower in Germany and the United Kingdom. And the answer is because they have workmen's compensation programs. And because the employers have to pay premiums into what is essentially an insurance fund. And the more dangerous your workplace, the higher your premium will be. Therefore, it creates a positive incentive for employers, factory owners, etc., to make their workplaces safer. And so workmen's compensation then is proposed by a group, and an interesting alliance that included progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, progressive industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, but also traditional progressive era reformers agree that the United States needs a program of workmen's compensation. But they experience fierce resistance from people saying, no, that's government encroachment. That's the government telling us what to do. That's a compromise of freedom and liberty. And so in that debate, and a parallel debate that takes place around the same time over child labor, we see the origins of our story. And that's why our book begins there.
Yeah. And how young were children being hauled off to work?
As young as 2 years old.
Unbelievable.
There's evidence from commissions here in Massachusetts that children as young as 2 years old were working in textile mills.
What could a 2-year-old do? That's
picking up scraps off the floor, bobbins that had been dropped, I know, you might think, what could a 2-year-old do? But they were put to work. There's also evidence that sometimes women brought their children into the workplace because they had no child care. And so often those children would get into trouble, be injured, this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in an early version of a kind of Merchants of Doubt story, as reformers published these reports about children working in textile mills, particularly here in Massachusetts, but also in the American South, mines as well, I never came across evidence of 2-year-olds in mines, but certainly children as young as 12 or 13 or 14, they start publishing disinformation. They start challenging the evidence, accusing the reformers of exaggerating the threat. That's a line we've heard of late, accusing them of, making up these statistics, claiming that it's not true, even though there's quite well documented evidence being brought to bear, and claiming that it's a threat to American freedom because a father, and again, there's a whole patriarchal element. This story is not about patriarchy and it's not about white supremacy, but you do see those elements coming in different places. A very patriarchal argument that it should really be up to fathers to decide whether or not his sons, and in some cases daughters, should go to work, not the government. So again, on one level, a legitimate, interesting question about, well, who actually should be responsible for the welfare of children? Oh, and this is one of my other favorite things. So some of the anti-reformers will say, well, no loving father would put his son into a dangerous situation. Well, one would hope that that was true. But of course, the reality is, particularly in immigrant families, that many immigrant families felt forced to put their children to work for basic survival. So even though there was enormous evidence that children were working, the anti-reform groups would say, oh, that can't be true. No loving father would do that, even though we had evidence that they did.
Right. Well, if you don't actually have options, not just choice, but options.
Exactly.
Viable options, right? I just had a woman named Rachel Moran who wrote a book called Paid For about her 7 years in prostitution in Dublin. Mm-hmm. And, she makes the point, no woman would choose to do this. And, pretty much every one of them has a horror story about why they do this, because they have to. Right. So it's not just, well, you have free choice, you're free. Well, you actually have to have viable economic options.
Right. One of my favorite quotations that I think we use somewhere in the book is the line from Anatole France, where he says, the law in its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike from sleeping under bridges.
Right. Nice. Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. Yes. Okay. So, and then also market failures, the distribution of electricity. Obviously, this is a good for everybody. A nation should want this for all its people. Why is the free market not able to solve that problem?
So, the electricity story was super fun to write, and I got to read all kinds of obscure early 20th century documents. So electricity is a really interesting example of market failure and the limits of markets for two reasons. First of all, early on, electricity was recognized as what people then and now call a natural monopoly. The idea that it would just be massively inefficient to have competing companies stringing electricity lines all over the place. So it made sense for one company to have a license to deliver electricity in a particular area. And so these licenses were granted, and electricity begins to develop as a regulated utility, which it still is today. But it was a sort of interest. So it's a private sector activity, but it is regulated. But the private sector companies that are emerging at this time find that they can deliver electricity in urban areas like New York, St. Louis, Chicago, and make a profit. So the profit motive, the market framework works in big cities like New York, but they can't make a profit delivering it to rural areas, or they can't make as much profit as they want to. And so they don't. And so by the 1920s, we have a situation where most of the major cities in the United States are electrified and most rural areas are not.
Because there's just not enough customers?
Right, exactly. That because you have the cost of bringing a line is more or less fixed, and so you need to distribute that cost over your customers. So if you have a lot of customers, pretty good model, but not so many, harder to make a profit. So a group of reformers led by Gifford Pinchot, who at the time was the governor of Pennsylvania, mostly known to historians of science as the first director of the U.S. Forest Service. He was a progressive Republican, an advocate of rational management of resources, and he says, well, this situation just isn't working because rural people need electricity. In fact, he argues farmers need it even more because you have these really hardworking farmers who could really benefit from electricity and they don't have it. And he points out that in Canada, where electricity has been developed on a different model, a public sector model, in Ontario, across the border from Pennsylvania and New York, rural customers do have electricity, and they have it at a lower price than customers in the United States. So it challenges the argument the private sector is making that they can't, do it without making a loss. So he develops a proposal called Giant Power, and it's a kind of public-private partnership that would solve the problem of rural electrification. He becomes the victims of a Merchants of Doubt style attack. And the one thing I have to say, I feel like I'm a pretty fortunate academic. I work very hard. I check my facts very much. I rarely have to take back anything I've said in a previous book. But I think in Merchants of Doubt, we did say that the tobacco industry developed this whole strategy. Not so. We now have found, I won't say the electricity industry invented it because someone else may still find something even earlier, but the same strategies and tactics being used by the electricity industry. So they launched this massive propaganda campaign to deny the facts. They hire academics to rewrite textbooks. They hire experts to claim that private sector electricity is cheaper than the municipal electricity in Ontario, even though it's not true. And they launch a personal attack on Pinchot and work hard to try to get him not reelected in Pennsylvania. They don't succeed, but they come close. And they spend millions and millions of dollars on this campaign. And a big part of the campaign is not just an argument about electricity, but an argument about government, that this is government encroachment, that government involvement in electricity markets threatens our freedom. And of course, 30 years later, the tobacco industry uses the exact same arguments. So I'm reading these materials, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's deja vu all over again. Right?
That's funny.
And they largely succeed. So the idea for Giant Power is thwarted. Pinchot does not achieve what he wants. But in the 1930s, and what they do is not illegal because at the time there are no laws against it. That changes in the 1930s with the development of the Federal Trade Commission and a set of laws, securities laws that get passed regarding, what you can and can't say to shareholders and consumers and stuff. So they later get investigated. In the 1930s, they get investigated, and the Federal Trade Commission concludes that this was the largest peacetime propaganda campaign in the history of the United States.
Wow.
There are reams and reams, volumes and volumes of investigations. Nothing much can really be done about it, though, because it's after the fact. But what is done under the New Deal when FDR becomes president is the federal government does, in fact, take on the task and succeeds in electrifying rural America under the Rural Electrification Administration.
Okay, explain how this works. Let's say I'm an electric company. I'm making a nice profit electrifying some big cities, and the government, comes to me and says, hey, we really need to electrify the rural places. And I go, I can't do it. It's just we can't afford it. And then you go, well, you're going to do it anyway because we think this is good for the America and industry and so on. It's like, all right, then you got to give me a subsidy because I can't make a profit otherwise, or what happens at that point?
Well, there's a set of different things. I'm not an expert on rural electrification, but the Rural Electrification Administration actually develops contracts with companies who are willing to put in these lines. And one of the interesting things that happens is that they support farmers to develop cooperatives where the farmers will raise the money to pay for the line. As the farmers begin to do this and show that actually they can do it economically, suddenly the industry says, oh, wait, we actually can do this. So then they move in because they don't want to lose the markets. So once REA demonstrates the proof of concept, then the private sector does begin to come on board. But they fight it tooth and nail. They fight it all the way. And there are all kinds of lawsuits in the 1930s. One of the key players in the lawsuits is Wendell Willkie, who later challenges FDR for the presidency. And Willkie had very close connections with the electricity industry. He had been a lawyer for I think it's the Southern Company, if I'm remembering correctly, who are still. So there's this big attempt by the electricity industry to push back against government electrification. They lose that fight. They lose in court and they lose economically because actually the government shows that it can be done and it's not massively costly. It's just not as profitable as the profits they were earning in urban areas.
Yeah, this idea of a natural monopoly, this would apply to railroads as well, right? I mean, we don't want 6 tracks going across Kansas or whatever.
Exactly. Also telephone and telegraph.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's no way to do it without government regulation or contracts or, we're just going to give you the land, this little strip, 500 feet across and 1,000 miles long, it's yours. And that's beside the other problem of, where did the government get that land in the first place? Well, we took it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Right, exactly. So much for property rights.
Right. Yeah, it's like when Napoleon sold Jefferson Louisiana, it's like, well, it wasn't his to sell and it wasn't Jefferson's to buy. I mean, this is just crazy. Right. So, I mean, it ultimately does come down to something like a power structure, like a government that just says, well, we're just declaring this ours and planting our flag. That's it. Now we can start with property rights or whatever. But even there, you have like just what was that with the great kind of migration to the West where I forget, with homesteading or whatever. First people
Homestead
there.
Act. Yeah.
Yeah. Homestead Act. Right. That's just the government saying, all right, this is not free market. Right. This is the government very much regulating it.
And that leads to one of the other chapters in our book, which is the story of the Little House on the Prairie books.
Oh, I love that story. That's incredible. I had no idea what that's. I never watched that show. I thought it was a little schmaltzy. I wasn't a big Michael Landon fan. I know he's handsome and everything, but not my type. Anyway, but I had no idea what that was about. All right, so talk about that. Yeah, that's part of it.
So it's kind of a heartbreaking story. I feel like so much of this book is kind of like et tu, Brute, So like millions of American girls, I grew up not watching the television show, but reading the books, the Little House on the Prairie series, which were marketed as the true life story of a young girl, Laura Ingalls Wilder, growing up on the American frontier. And I, like many other girls, devoured those books, loved the stories, but didn't actually know that they weren't true stories. What we learned writing this book, and here we draw a fair amount on secondary literature, there's important books that have been written about this, that the books were actually mostly written by Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was a libertarian ideologue. She was a friend of Herbert Hoover. She was an associate of Leonard Read. She was a correspondent of J. Howard Pugh. She was very much in with this network of anti-government, pro-business ideologues who had fought the New Deal. She hated FDR with a visceral passion. And she took her mother's stories and crafted them as libertarian parables of success through hard work, individualism, and the government mostly doesn't appear at all. When it does appear, it only appears in a bad way, completely effacing the entire history of the Homestead Act, without which the Wilder family would never have been there, effacing the role of the government in displacing and removing Indians. Not to say that that was a good thing that the government did, but the point is, none of this story would even have happened without massive government structuring of the frontier. And the other part of the story is that actually the Wilder family was not successful. Their story of the attempt to thrive on the plains was actually a story of repeated failures, but it's reconstructed into a success story of a happy family succeeding by dint of their own hard labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as you said, and then later it becomes a television series starring Michael Landon. And, these books were read by millions of Americans. The TV series was seen by millions of Americans. And again, I don't know if the TV show necessarily tried to portray itself as the true stories, but the books were certainly marketed that way.
Yeah, yeah. Bonanza was a little bit like that. I watched that in the 60s. My dad liked Bonanza.
I actually recently rewatched some reruns of Bonanza.
You did?
Old television is a real window into cultural beliefs in the given moment.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, a couple other of these problems to be solved. The Triangle Shirt Waste Factory Fire in 1911, mine collapses, railroad accidents. Yeah, so, I mean, without regulation, it just ripped from the headlines, this massive earthquake in Turkey, 28,000 people dead and climbing. Why, if that happened in Southern California here, where we have earthquakes, the death toll would be nothing like that. Why? Because we have regulations for buildings.
Exactly. And of course, if this book hadn't been finished when this earthquake just happened, it would have been a perfect epilogue to the book. But you're absolutely right. I mean, ask yourself, why is it we have a massive earthquake in California and maybe 12 people are killed? Loma Prieta, I think the death toll was something like 15 or 20. A comparable earthquake in Turkey kills 20,000. And the answer to that is almost entirely building codes. Geology has a little bit to do with it, but very, very little. It's mostly about building codes. One can build buildings that are just about earthquake proof, not 100%, but to a very great extent. We've had major earthquakes in California where maybe a section, well, it was bad when the piece of the Oakland Bay
210
Bridge.
freeway, yeah. Oh,
that was bad. 210 freeway, right? I mean, there have been some engineering failures, but in general, they've been small, and the casualties have been typically in the single or double digits. But if you don't have building codes, then buildings collapse and they kill people. And almost no one is ever killed in an earthquake by the earth quaking. People are killed because things fall on them, typically mostly buildings, also sometimes roads and bridges. That's all about government regulation. Now, admittedly, it costs money. It does make it more expensive to build the building up front, but it saves lives. So often what we find is that in poor countries, we don't have adequate regulation because it's perceived as not financially possible. But you can, well, we don't really tell this story in the book, but there was a famous story that I came across years ago when I was writing on the history of geology. Bailey Willis was a professor of geology at Stanford, who in the early 20th century, 1910s and 20s, had worked really, really hard to try to get better building codes in California. So he was a bit ahead of his time. And towards the end of his life, he said, I didn't manage to get better building codes, but I did manage to raise the price of earthquake insurance. But the fact is, he personally didn't get the building codes, but in the fullness of time, we did get those building codes, and they save huge numbers of lives.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me. I live in the mountains above Santa Barbara, up in the fire zone, and I can't get insurance. But I do have fire insurance through the California Fair Plan. The government says you have to have fire insurance. No fire insurance company will insure me, so the government does it. And
that's a two-edged sword. Not all government insurance is good. I mean, I personally think that the government should no longer issue flood insurance in areas that are extremely flood prone, because it does create a kind of perverse incentive for people to live in places where they shouldn't live. So that's a good example of a government program that's pretty two-edged sword. And I don't agree. I remember during one of the primaries, Julian Castro saying, "Oh, we have to increase federal flood insurance." I'm like, no, we don't. So I'm not saying all government programs are good or right-minded. And sometimes a program that makes sense at a particular time maybe doesn't make sense down the road. I mean, given what we know about climate change and the flood risks, there are certain parts of America where people probably do need now to not rebuild after floods. And so we need a different model. But again, it's not to say there's no role for government. It's to say we have to think through what is an effective and efficient and useful role for government.
Right. During the big rainstorm we had last month, Ellen DeGeneres posted a video on Twitter. She lives in Montecito down here, right next to this massive creek that every 5 years it floods and wipes out houses. And she's like, Mother Nature is very pissed off at us. It's like, well, if you didn't live right next to the creek that floods every 5 years, all you rich people.
Yeah, right.
That's too funny.
Well, and this is a good example of how climate change doesn't just affect the poor; it affects rich people too.
Yeah, everybody. Right. Yeah. All right. So these are collective action problems. How do you solve them? It requires some kind of organization of people, whether it's a private, a collective to solve problems like fishing regulations or hunting restrictions, or the government does it. One way or the other, it has to be done, right? And so, like, you made a simple example in the book of stop signs. All right, so my freedom is restricted. I'm only allowed to drive on the right side of the road in America. I have to stop at these stop signs and the red lights and so on. But I'm freer because of that. And
exactly.
It's so obvious and simple, but the narrative you hear again in this kind of market fundamentalism is that, these kinds of restrictions on my freedom are unfair or immoral or unjust. And like taxation, you'll here's the typical kind of libertarian or anarcho-capitalist argument that, if I don't pay my taxes, let's say I don't file my returns or whatever. Actually, when I was at Pepperdine, I went to my roommate and I went to one of these income tax revolt seminars, and they had a whole story about, the income tax was never actually ratified by Congress. You don't have to pay your income taxes. It's a big myth. And I remember, but it was kind of coherent when you were sitting there listening with the slides and so on, yeah. And then you walk away and you go, but how could that be true? Because smarter people than me would not be paying their taxes if this was true, right? I mean,
right.
Come on. I don't know. And, and my roommate, he went for it, and then they caught up with him later. But the argument is, okay, so then the IRS sends you the letter. If you don't pay the letter, eventually you get they'll come to your door if necessary, right? Men with guns. So This is the argument, as you've heard this. It's theft. The government is coming with armed men to take your stuff, right? And we should just do it voluntarily. Well, okay, but how do you do that voluntarily if not everybody wants to volunteer to pay, right? So it's a collective action problem, like the fire department or whatever. We still have to put this guy's house out even though he didn't pay for the fire service because his house is going to burn out other people's house. So you're going to get that kind of regulation anyway. I think it was either a Simpsons or Family Guy episode where the main character decides we're not paying taxes anymore, and then so all of a sudden the trash disposal system is broken down. There's trash everywhere, and it's like, what are we going to do? He goes, okay, I have an idea. We're going to all pitch into this collective pot, and we're going to pay for this. What if somebody doesn't pay? We're going to make them pay. It's like, wait a minute, we're back to where we started.
Exactly. Well, that's right. And I think, so these are collective action problems. And again, that's why it's really a question about where we draw the line. What sort of things do we think we have to pay taxes for? What sort of things can we leave to individuals, private charity? And of course, there's a place for individual responsibility. And of course, there's a place for private charity. But, I think one of the really telling examples in the story is the example of the Great Depression, because the Great Depression was unprecedented in U.S. history. We'd had all kinds of small recessions, bank panics, business cycles. That wasn't a new thing. And to give Herbert Hoover a little bit of credit, in the early years after the crash of 29, it wasn't completely unreasonable to think that this was just another example of a business cycle and that we would get out of it. But when and Hoover, he was an advocate of what he called voluntary associationalism. He thought, and this is actually really interesting because it's really socialistic. This is another example of a person who our view of who they were and what they thought is actually pretty different from the reality. So one of the problems that led to the Great Crash, the Great Depression, was overproduction, particularly in agriculture. Too much. We were victims of our own success. Farmers were producing so much food that the price of crops collapsed, and so farmers were going out of business. And when farmers went out of business, defaulted on their loans, then rural communities, would ramify through all aspects of the community. So he had the idea that farmers and businesses should voluntarily agree to reduce production to solve the problem of overproduction. So a kind of socialism, really. But it didn't happen. And it didn't happen in some ways because of the Adam Smith argument. I mean, you could view it as a tragedy of the commons argument or however you like to think of it. But the individual farmer has a self-interest in producing as much as he can, even though that could be bad for the community. And so that's why some kind of remedy was needed. In addition, Hoover also felt that he was not a heartless person. He had actually organized famine relief after World War I, but he thought it should be done by private charity. And that model had actually succeeded in Belgium. He was the coordinator of Belgian famine relief after World War I. So he thought, well, we'll just do that again. Except the problem was that the scale of the Great Depression simply overwhelmed anything that private charity could do. And so there was a need for a larger scale response. And that's why FDR gets elected. And that's why we end up with the New Deal, to mobilize the power of government, because the scale of the problem was one that needed that. And that's how I think a lot about climate change today, because as you know, I came to this issue originally through climate change as a market failure. In theory, it would be great if we all just drove less and ate less red meat and reduced our carbon footprint. We could solve the climate change problem. Yeah, but the problem is we can't. And we can't for a number of reasons. One is because the scale of the problem is too big for an individual. And another is because there are aspects of the problem that individuals cannot solve themselves. So I always like to say to my audiences, I can change my light bulbs, but I can't change my electricity grid, right? We need to do that together, and to do it together means doing it through our government structures.
Yeah. After the 2008 meltdown in the financial markets and housing markets, and the kind of public awareness in my sport, cycling, of the massive doping problem, as I got to rethinking kind of my libertarianism in that context, that it's not that anybody was motivated to cheat just for cheating's sake, but that if everybody else thinks that everybody else is doing it, then you kind of have to do it to be competitive. Right. Just in the sport of cycling, let's say the new drugs like EPO, erythropoietin, that produces red blood cells, and that generates more oxygen in your muscles and so on. And it's not like a 0.5% difference. It's like 10% difference.
Wow.
It's a huge performance.
Wow.
So if you think so if one other person's doing it, one of the other top, say 10 riders or whatever, then you pretty much have to do it. And I wrote an article for Scientific American on kind of game theory logic of doping in sports, not just cycling, but baseball as well. And so I interviewed some people, like one of Lance Armstrong's teammates, Frankie Andrea, who said he didn't want to dope. He just liked being a bike racer. But that at some point when EPO was introduced into the peloton, say 1991, 2, 3, right around that time frame, he went from being, one of the best teammates a guy could have. He wasn't like a tour winner, but he was like the next notch down. Where he would then, like Lance would send him back to the team cars at the back of the peloton. So it's way back. There's like 2 miles back. The peloton is stretched out so far. And then you got to get the water bottles, stuff them in your jersey, and work your way all the way back up to the front where Lance is, right? And he said at some point I just couldn't even do that because everybody is all juiced up and going so fast. And then just a little roller, he would get dropped, and that's it. I mean, if you're dropped, you can't even really be on the team anymore. So at this point, everybody is doing it, right? So part of Lance's problem when he went on Oprah was he didn't really adequately explain what was really going on. Everybody is doing it. And it's not that they all want to cheat and they're cheaters and dopers and, immoral. And so, no, it's just that it was a collective action problem that no one could solve. Much like before that, wearing around that same time, wearing a helmet, which is better for everybody. And cyclists were dying when they hit their head on the pavement. And none of them wanted to wear that. They all wanted to wear a helmet for safety purposes, but no one wanted to do it when no one else was wearing it, right? So at some point, UCI just said, all right, you all have to wear helmets. Like, okay, good, right?
Yeah,
so
that's a great story, right? Because I think it illustrates at least 3 important things. One is, you need rules and regulations, like you need rules of the road, right? In this case, the roads of cycling. And you need enforcement, because of course the rules don't do any good if you don't have meaningful enforcement, which is why we have the IRS to collect taxes, right? And then also, and this is maybe a bad pun, but if you don't, it's a race to the bottom, right? And that
Yes.
was what capitalism in the late 19th century looked like, right? It kind of raced to the bottom. Nobody wanted to, and this argument came up in the arguments about child labor. There were manufacturers who said, yeah, we don't really like using children, but they're cheaper than adults. And if we don't, somebody else will, and et cetera. And of course, we hear that argument all the time in all walks of lives. Our teenage kids tell us that as well. So this is why you need systems of agreed upon rules of regulation and appropriate, adequate, not punitive, but adequate enforcement.
Right. So the deregulation of banks in the 1990s, which started off good, then kind of erupts into this 2008 meltdown because of all these weird, investment tools like these collateral debt obligations. And I don't know why I never even heard of these things until I started reading about it. And it's like, they're doing what? Right. And it's not that any one trader or banker or whatever is just trying to cheat the system. It's just like, but this is what everybody else is doing. So I imagine some salesman in there in his little office and the boss comes in and goes, how many X's did you do today? And, if it's below the average of what is expected, he's got to do whatever he's got to do to keep his job, right? And so the whole thing just kind of cascades along like that until it collapses. So you need somebody to come in and go, okay, you can't do that anymore. No one's doing that anymore.
Right. And it also relates to the trope of individual responsibility. So that, a lot of times conservatives, libertarians will say, well, I believe in individual responsibility. I think it should be up to individuals to decide for themselves. Again, that's fine up to a point, but one of the things that drove the 2008 mortgage collapse was that banks were pushing customers to take on mortgages that they knew those customers could not manage. So you could blame the customer. You could say, well, that was stupid to get in over your head. And in a way it was, But you could also say that it was wrong of the banks to push these products on people that they knew couldn't manage to pay back their loans. And if you think traditionally our image of a banker is that a responsible banker, kind of almost the other way around, right? That someone wants to borrow money and the banker says, sorry, no, you can't, right? And here we know for a fact that many banks were pushing, and they were pushing instruments on people that they didn't understand. So many of these mortgages were adjustable rates with balloon payments. That was not explained clearly to the customer. Suddenly the customer finds themselves with these gigantic payments that they didn't realize. Again, you could say, well, the customer should have read the fine print, but the reality is, even those of us with PhDs don't always read the fine print, right?
I know,
yeah.
Right, exactly. Also, I think our brains are not wired to understand compound interest either way. Like, how much should you invest in 30 years? This is how much you're going to have. People are way lowball those estimates. But on the flip side, well, my credit card is only this, and if I make the minimum payments, this is going to be fine. If you make the minimum payment on your credit card, you're going to be paying this thing for years. Right.
But we all get those emails all the time encouraging us to get another credit card. When did you ever get an email that said, now, if you only pay the minimum payment, here's an example of how much, no, They never do that. They tell you all about the benefits, the airline points. So, a lot of this is about the story that's told. We're told stories that encourage us to take out loans we maybe can't afford, or to take out credit cards that will saddle us with giant debts and bills. And again, up to a point, credit cards are good. Most of us appreciate the convenience of a credit card, right? But without adequate regulatory oversight, the abuses can quickly skyrocket. And that's what we see in the savings and loan crisis, where, the argument was made that deregulation would be good for the customers, getting back to where we started this conversation. It would lower costs for consumers. And at first it did, but it ended up saddling the American taxpayer with, multi-hundred-billion-dollar bills.
Yeah. Well, when you read about bank collapses, runs on banks, like in the one of my favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life, where there's the run on the banks, and it's like, well, that can't happen now, can it? And the reason it can't really is because of the FDIC, and the government just said, we're insuring your money. It's so that no one does this anymore. And I'm glad about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important take-homes, I think, from the book is we've been told the story about markets are efficient, government is inefficient. Government is filled with waste. Government is filled with fraud. But of course, the private sector has waste and fraud too, but we don't hear those stories so much. So this is really about the power of narrative and the power of propaganda. So, and I think, this is a place where I think Democrats have really been asleep at the wheel. We have a lot of government programs that have worked really well, that have achieved their goals. And FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is one of those success stories that no one tells, right? But before the 1930s, banks routinely collapsed. Bank runs were common enough you could make a movie about it, and the audience would understand what it was about. It's also in Mary Poppins, right? It's the key pivotal scene in Mary Poppins, right, where there's the run on the bank.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
These things were common, and people lost money, and communities were damaged, and that's part of the whole story of the Dust Bowl is bank failures that lead to community failure. That doesn't happen anymore because of a government program that works, and it's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was put in place as one of the many New Deal reforms. But it's not the only one. Social Security works. I'm writing a column right now about why Republicans have to hate Social Security, because actually it's big government that works. Before the 1930s, elderly poverty was widespread in the United States. Nowadays, it's pretty rare because Social Security achieved its goal of giving us secure retirements. Medicare, hugely successful program. 80% of Americans approve of Medicare. I mean, all of us, well, we may be approaching that age ourselves. Certainly we've had parents. I didn't have to worry about my parents' medical bills because it was taken care of. These are very, very successful big government programs. But somehow we don't hear those stories, right? Well, we hear the stories about waste, abuse, Social Security is bankrupt, even though it's not, because there's been this drumbeat of anti-government propaganda that we've been subjected to. And what we show in the book is how much of that was organized, financed. The stories were written and told by business interests who were trying to protect their own right to do whatever they wanted and to try to convince us that somehow that was in our own interest as well.
Okay, let's review some of that sort of post-World War II, all these characters that I held up, Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and Ayn Rand and Ronald Reagan and the GE, General Electric Theater. I didn't know about any of that backstory to these books.
Well, that makes me feel happy that we've done something important then. I know, and this is one of the interesting things. So many of these people are big names, but people read these books, but they don't really ask the question, where are these ideas coming from and how well are they supported by evidence? So one of the things we track in the book is how these ideas get promoted after World War II. Because up until World War II, the National Association of Manufacturers is not really succeeding in convincing people of this. I mean, in the face of the Great Depression, telling the American people to just trust big business is not really a credible argument. But after World War II, they remobilize and they sort of double down. And one of the things they do is they recruit academics to try to give the argument intellectual credibility. So they recruit two of the key people you just mentioned, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. And it's not a coincidence that they both have German names. They're Austrians and they're considered the founders of neoliberalism, the Austrian School of Economics. And that's a big, complicated subject that we don't have time to go into all the details. But the key point is that what these business leaders realize is that von Mises and von Hayek are essentially making the argument that they want. And it's what they call the indivisibility thesis, or sometimes they use the word inseparability. It's this argument that capitalism and freedom are two sides of the same coin, because if you compromise economic freedom, you're on a slippery slope to Soviet-style totalitarian communism. And therefore, you must defend and protect against compromises to economic freedom, lest you lose your political freedom. Well, this is just perfect for the National Association of Manufacturers. It's exactly the argument that they want, that they need. One of the things we did in the book was try to figure out the chicken and egg thing. Like, do they get it from von Mises or do they recruit von Mises? And there's some evidence for both sides of that argument. We know that von Mises was serving as a consultant to the National Association of Manufacturers in the 1930s. But in the 1940s, they bring him and von Hayek to the United States. And they do it in a very irregular and frankly hypocritical manner. Because as we know, these people are great advocates of free markets. They're great advocates of open competition. But they don't put out an ad saying, we want to hire some smart economists. They work behind the scenes, behind closed doors, to get von Mises hired at NYU and to get von Hayek hired at the University of Chicago. And in fact, the economics department does not want von Hayek because they consider his argument not sufficiently empirical, that he doesn't actually have evidence to support it, that it's a kind of political track. It's not actually a work of economic research. But they meet with the president of the University of Chicago. They offer to pay von Hayek's salary for 10 years, and he agrees. So he is hired at the University of Chicago, and they do it specifically with the idea of taking these Austrian economic views and popularizing them in the United States. And so they do a set of different things, and we probably don't have time here to talk about all of them, but one of the key things is that they produce a bowdlerized version of Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom. And it's published in Reader's Digest, as a Reader's Digest condensed book. And it's very similar to what they then do to Adam Smith. So von Hayek is a complicated person, but his book is a sophisticated book. And like Adam Smith, he's not a market absolutist. He actually has a whole interesting discussion of where the government does need to get involved. And warming my heart, one of the specific examples he uses is controlling pollution and deforestation. And he says, this is legitimate, so you have to have a conversation. But in general, he says, you want to argue against government involvement in the marketplace for all these reasons we've just been discussing. So they strip out all those caveats. They strip out the recognition of the legitimate role of government in preventing pollution and deforestation. He also talks about workplace safety. And they just produce this sort of extremist vision that all government involvement is bad and just leave everything to the marketplace. And if you don't, you will end up in a Nazi-style dictatorship. And they also switch, like in the original European argument, it's really an argument against Soviet-style communism. But now they make an argument against Nazi Germany because the United States has just finished a war against Nazi Germany. So, of course, Nazi Germany is the enemy. And, of course, this is completely historically ridiculous. But So they publish that in Reader's Digest, and then they also produce a literal cartoon version. They reduced the book to a set of cartoons, which they publish in Look magazine, which at the time was one of the largest mass circulation magazines in America. So we know that millions and millions of Americans would have been exposed to these flattened, this sort of flattened version of the Austrian economics argument.
Yeah, you have that that little sort of point by point on how they did that road to serfdom simplification in 18 points. War forces national planning. Many want planning to stay. The planners promise utopia. They can't agree on one utopia, and citizens can't agree either. Planners hate to force agreement, so they try to sell the plan to all. The gullible do find agreement. Confidence in planners fades. A strong man is given power. That sounds familiar. The party takes over the country. A negative aim welds party unity. No one opposes the leader's plan. Your profession is planned. Your wages are planned. Your thinking is planned. Your recreation is planned. Your disciplining is planned. And all of a sudden, you're living in the Soviet Union. So
and the final cartoon is the firing squad, the dissenters shot.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So it's hard not to make slippery slope arguments. I mean, Lyndon Johnson made the slippery slope argument about, the dominoes. If we don't go to Vietnam and they're going to do this and they're going to do that, there's kind of a logic to it. It could happen. It has happened. Doesn't happen that often. You'll see conservatives today look at Venezuela. That's what Biden wants to do. It's people fall for that because, I don't know, there is kind of an underlying logic to it, I guess. It could happen. It's not impossible.
Well, right. It's not impossible. But the point is that, again, it gets back to what we were talking before about making choices. We make judgments about where we draw the line. So, when the tobacco industry said, well, if you allow the government to control tobacco, next thing you know, they're controlling everything. Well, no, that's actually not right. Tobacco is a deadly product, and you're marketing it to children, and you're lying about it. So saying that we could draw a line against products that kill children, that's not actually that difficult a choice to make. And that's kind of our argument of the book, right? That as intelligent people, we can make choices. And we might decide, as in fact we have decided in America, that we're not going to ban tobacco, because we tried that with alcohol and it didn't work very well. There are still people I know who think tobacco should be, we should have tobacco abolition. I'm not one of those people, but we can make choices, right? We can say, we're going to make it hard to sell. We're going to put punitive taxes on it. We're going to limit tobacco advertising, because we can make intelligent choices, and we can make choices about what works because we also have evidence. And again, not to sound like I'm being fetishistic about science, but the reality is we have good evidence that high tobacco taxes work, because most people start smoking as teenagers. And if you don't start smoking by the time you're 25, the odds are very low that you would smoke. And teenagers are very sensitive to price. So if you make tobacco smoking very expensive, it will discourage teenagers from smoking. So you don't have to ban it. You don't have to control the world. You don't have to assign those teenagers to specific jobs, right? Right? But you can limit their access to tobacco.
I was just in the Frankfurt airport over Thanksgiving break because my wife's from Germany, and so we went to visit. And in the duty-free store were big boxes of cigarette, cartons of cigarettes. I've never seen anything like it. There's like pictures of lungs and some guy with a hole in his throat and some woman whose lungs and breasts are all just rotting away. And this is going to kill you. It's like,
but if you want to smoke, you still can.
And the price was, it was just ridiculous. It was a couple bucks a cigarette or something. It's like, who would do this? You would think that would work. Okay, a couple of things about Reagan, and since he's so famous and so well known, how did he get his start? Tell us about this General Electric Theater. It's such a great story.
Yes, this is another great story. So most people know that before Reagan became president of the United States or governor of California, he was an actor. But very few people know about how he went from being an actor to a politician. And they also don't know that when he was an actor, he was actually a union president. He was a pro-union New Deal Democrat. And a few years later, he's an anti-union, anti-government Republican. So how does that happen? So the answer that we found through our research was that when Reagan's career was sagging in the mid-50s, he gets recruited by General Electric to be the host of a television program called General Electric Theater. It was an extremely successful program. At one point, it was the third most popular program in the United States, behind the Ed Sullivan Show. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I Love Lucy. And so every week, his voice, his persona are beamed into millions and millions of American homes. So he becomes known to the American people in a way that he had not been before through this very successful television show. And he works with the producers to choose the stories, which are didactic stories of success through individualism, individual hard work, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and you don't need the government to help you. Now, it turns out, and there's been a certain amount written about his work at GE Theater, but that was actually only half his job. The other half of his job was to going on the lecture circuit, visiting factories, visiting communities where GE had facilities, speaking to Rotary clubs, school groups, teachers, to promote GE's vision of the world. And that vision was a stridently anti-union, anti-government vision. In fact, it was so anti-union that GE was actually cited by the National Labor Relations Board for violations of the Wagner Act for unfair practices in terms of union negotiations. So, and GE, you'll love this, distributed reading lists to its manufacturers, and its reading list was just about what you showed us at the start of this conversation.
Right.
Henry Hazlitt, von Hayek, probably the Reader's Digest version of von Hayek, a whole set of anti-government, pro-market, libertarian, some almost borderline crypto-anarchist writings, which they would give these reading lists to their managers and instruct them that they should be reading these books. And then they would encourage workers to create book groups to read these books and to tell their families about it. And they also had magazines and newsletters that went home to all of the families of GE workers. So the GE workers would read articles like by someone like Henry Hazlitt promoting free market economics and giving them the message that the union might claim to represent your interests, but they don't really. The union is corrupt. The union is not representing you. But the company, you can trust us because we have your interests at heart. So this very paternalistic, very controlling message. And that was the message that Reagan then spent several years going across the country delivering. Now, we don't know for sure because we don't have access to his inside brain, and he didn't leave any diaries or personal writings that are available to the public. He may have done, but they're not in the Reagan archives. But during this period, he completely changes his political views. And so this process of working with and for GE, and he comes out of it with something that's sometimes referred to as the speech. It's the speech that he gives in the nomination of Barry Goldwater for the presidential election. And that becomes the core of Reagan's ideology, which he carries forward. Now, there's one more piece. So now he decides to leave GE and run for governor of California, which is a pretty big leap for someone who has never held public office. I mean, nowadays that happens a fair amount, but in those days that was pretty unusual. So how does he even do that? Well, he also emerges from GE with a set of corporate backers who finance his run for governor and who help him hire a team of people to get him up to speed on a whole set of policy issues that he knows nothing about.
Interesting. Yeah, that's so fascinating. So for GE to spend that kind of time and money, they must have believed that it would make a difference to their bottom line in the long run.
Yes, exactly. And the other wonderful irony of this story is, so while they're promoting this giant free market, pro-market, anti-government, just trust us, we're great, we're experts, we're building better things for better living. No, that's DuPont. But where progress is our most important product. That was the GE slogan. They are conspiring with Westinghouse and other electricity companies to rig electricity markets.
Interesting. Right. Okay, let's talk about capitalism and religion. When did Jesus become a capitalist? I thought you're supposed to help the poor. The moral majority, Reagan, 1980s, 1990s. Now, religion is conservative. Christian conservatives, believe in free markets. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, so again, this is another part of the story. And as you said, I mean, if you know your Bible, you know that the message of Jesus is one of loving the poor. It's a message of compassion. It's a message of caring for your fellow person. And so in the 1940s, some of the people who are in our story realized that they actually have a problem, that true Christianity is not actually compatible with a kind of dog-eat-dog, laissez-faire, fend for yourself view of the world. And many Christian theologians back in the 30s are saying as much. They're saying that we need the New Deal because we need to help the poor, people who are out of work for no fault of their own. And so a group of people, mostly led by J. Howard Pugh, who was a leader in the National Association of Manufacturers and also the president of the Sun Oil Corporation, decide that they need to do something to persuade Christians to come on board with this pro-capitalist message. And so they finance a man by the name of James Fifield, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, based in Los Angeles, to begin an organization called Spiritual Mobilization. And the purpose of spiritual mobilization is to persuade Protestants. They're not particularly interested in Catholics. They're kind of anti-Catholic. They're also anti-Semitic, but that's a different story. To persuade Protestants that Christianity and capitalism are not just compatible, but actually go hand in hand. And so they begin to publish magazines. There's a magazine called Christian Economics. They do newsletters. They write sermons, which they distribute to ministers around the country, suggesting that they should use these materials in their sermons. They work with seminaries to try to change the curricula in seminary to be more pro-capitalist and less pro-poor. And arguably they succeed. And so, as you say, we see this enormous transformation in American Protestantism from the 1920s and 30s, has a very, what in hindsight would seem like a very progressive message about caring for the poor, to what we see today, which is the strong alignment of American evangelical Christianity with pro-capitalists, not sympathetic to the poor arguments. And one of the fun details in this story is that among the people they fund are Norman Vincent Peale, who later officiates at the first marriage of Donald Trump to his first wife, Ivana. Yeah. Ivanka's the daughter, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Wait,
yeah,
which is
Ivana.
the mom? Yeah, Ivana was the mom, right? So it's
Right.
always hard to keep track. Yeah. So there's actually, this book is
And
not
the parents
about
too, right? Fred
and the parents,
Mary.
right? Fred and Mary are parishioners, right? So this book is not about Donald Trump, but it's very interesting to see there actually is a direct line from spiritual mobilization through Norman Vincent Peale to the Trump family.
Yeah. Yeah, because of Peele's message of kind of independence and willpower and, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps and so on. That is a feel-good message, right? I think people like to hear that. It kind of gives them a sense of agency, like I can do something. And that's a good thing, I think.
Absolutely. As I said before, for a myth to work, it's not a lie, right? A myth is not the same as a lie. For a myth to be successful, it has to have kernels of truth in it. And so I think Norman Vincent Peale is a good example of that, the power of positive thinking. There is a lot of power in positive thinking, and it is good to feel empowered and to feel that you have agency. But it's also good to recognize that there are many things in the world that happen that are not our fault, that sometimes we do need the help of our fellow citizens or government. Or as you said, you gave the example, if we want to drive on a road, we need rules of the road. We need stoplights and stop signs and speed limits. Otherwise, we just all crash.
Right. You're not free.
You're not free. Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Or as my husband likes to say, he's in favor of freeways. You have a limited access to get on the freeway. And in exchange for that, it's a freeway. You get to drive really fast.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So that's where rules and regulations can actually be empowering and enable you to do things that you couldn't do if you didn't have those rules and regulations.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about Ayn Rand a little bit. When I was at Pepperdine, everybody was reading Atlas Shrugged, and it took me a long time to get around to trying to just get through the first 100 pages was difficult, right? But there was kind of an inspirational sense to it. So I think there's two aspects. There's kind of the economic theory behind it, and then something else, the personal agency sort of thing. And so like I'll just read to you one portion that people don't actually hear very often, but this is from the close of John Galt's speech, 65 pages in this novel, which is why it's never been made into a good movie. I saw the trilogy. You talk about the trilogy of Atlas Shrugged. It was, even though I wanted to love this movie, it was terrible. and
I have to confess, I've brought myself to read a lot of terrible things and to watch a lot of terrible movies and television, but I have to confess, I did not watch that one. I just read the reviews.
Somebody just, let's see, no, it's Ben Shapiro's company, the Daily Wire that he works for. They just purchased the rights and they want to do a remake of it that would be better. Actually, I'm in one of the crowd scenes in I think it's the first film, or it might be the second one, with my daughter. We're just talking in the background while Francisco is giving his speech about money, and money is not the root of all evil and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so here's the closing line from Galt's speech. In the name of the best within you, do not sacrifice to this world to those who are its worst. In the name of the values that keep you alive, do not let your vision of man be distorted by the ugly, the cowardly, the mindless, and those who have never achieved his title. Do not lose your knowledge that man's proper estate is an upright posture, an intransigent mind, and a step that travels unlimited roads. Do not let your fire go out, sparked by irreplaceable spark, in the hopeless swamps of the approximate, the not quite, the not yet, the not at all. Do not let the hero in your soul perish in lonely frustration for the life you deserved and have never been able to reach. Check your road and the nature of your battle. The world you desired can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It is yours. Right? So people read that and go, yeah. Right? I mean, without thinking about, well, what does this mean for taxation or immigration policy? I don't know. I just feel good, feeling empowered that way.
Yeah, well, most people I know who read that book read it in high school, and I could see why it would appeal to a 15-year-old boy, because essentially saying, yes, do what you want, which is what all teenagers want to hear. What's amazing to me about this so-called philosophy is that grown-ups still subscribe to it, because if you actually stop to think about it, this message of radical individualism, so radical that, it warrants violence in some cases, right? Like in the Fountainhead. It makes no sense. It's actually incoherent. People don't just live as individuals, and it flies in the face of reality. Think about it. We all live, the vast majority of us live in families, or
right.
Well,
most Rand of us had no families. There's no families in the books.
I know, and it's really interesting. I actually find her to be a kind of tragic figure. I think that she must have been. It seems like there's a lot of self-hatred there or something. I don't know, but I don't want to psychoanalyze her. But she strikes me as actually a sad person. Anyone who would think that, does she have no friends? Does she have no family? Why is she so angry, right? She's so angry at society. And some of that does have to do with her personal experience fleeing the Soviet Union. But anger and hatred are not really great positions from which to build a coherent social philosophy.
No.
And the reality is we do need other people. We need our families. We need our friends. We need our schools and our hospitals. We need our doctors and our dentists. No one lives alone, right? John Donne said that, in 1600, no man is an island. So it's a weird denial of so many of the realities of society. And of course, societies can go wrong. And the Soviet Union did go wrong. And I'm not saying I would ever have wanted to live there. In fact, I'm Jewish, so my people would have been oppressed as well if they had stayed. But, it's a kind of incredible denial of so many of the complicated realities. And I think, I can see why it appeals to, as I said, to teenage boys. It's so simplistic and it's so easy, right? Just do what you want and it's all going to be, bring out the best in yourself. And it's also so incredibly condescending because, after all, who's deciding who's best? There's a kind of sneering hostility towards people who, what she considers lesser, but who are those people exactly? Are they working class people? Are they people of color? Are they Native Americans? It's never entirely clear, but the heroes of her books are all white men.
And women, right?
Some women, but mostly men, right?
Well, see, this has always been curious to me because, in terms of identity politics, where your identity trumps your politics. Not really. I think sometimes your politics trumps. So in this case, Rand, she's a woman, an immigrant of a minority. She's Jewish, atheist, and her female characters are strong feminist women who run corporations, and they're powerful and they're strong, intelligent, creative, and so on. Why don't feminists like her? And I think, well, because her politics suck, and that then trumps the identity, right? I think that's probably what's going on there.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to know. I'm not a Rand expert, but what I'll just put in, though, again, with some of the hypocrisies that we've talked about. So Rand puts forward this philosophy of radical freedom, radical individualism, but at the same time, when she's in Hollywood, she writes Hollywood's most influential censorship code. So square that circle for me.
Right. Yeah. No, I love that part in your book. Really, I would recommend every libertarian, classical liberal, conservative read The Big Myth. It's important to know where these ideas come from. We have to be careful of the genetic fallacy. It's not that makes the ideas wrong. You have to evaluate the ideas on their own, but you do that as well and show that using let's call it the comparative method. Okay, so compare America to Germany or the UK, who also have vibrant, successful economies, and they have all these other social benefits that go along with that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would recommend people read some of the biographies of Ayn Rand if you're interested. Jennifer Burns. Jennifer Burns is quite good on this. It's not just the Russian background to her. I think just by temperament, she was an angry
Yeah.
person at her funeral, well, Barbara Brandon opens her memoir of her life with Ayn Rand with this scene at the funeral where there's nobody there. I mean, she has no friends. You know, she basically kicked everybody out. I always thought that was funny too. You mentioned this in your book about libertarians fighting amongst themselves. Who's not libertarian enough? Right. And I think Ayn Rand felt like Hayek. It was either Hayek or Friedman or somebody she decided was not libertarian enough.
No. And that she thinks, right, because Hayek does in fact acknowledge that you do need government, right? Yeah. And my favorite one is when Ludwig von Mises, though, says that Rose Wilder Lane is in that.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So you can go the other way, too. You can be like, okay, she's got off the deep end, right? Yeah.
That may be true for all social groups, though. You know, who's the true feminist or the true Marxist or the true atheist? Atheism went through this after Dawkins, really put it on the map in '06. And, who's really militant, a real militant atheist, like a Hitchens or a Dawkins. And it's like, what if you're not really militant? Oh, no, then you're not a real atheist.
Yeah. Right. And those arguments are always silly because, again, they take us away from what is the real question, which is, here's where I'll come back to Adam Smith. I mean, I think he was right about the question. How do we generate wealth and prosperity and a good life, right? I mean, and how do we share that wealth in the most, well, let's just say in the best way, however we define best, right? And so many of these arguments lose sight of that because they become ideologically driven, or they become a kind of religious faith, which is why we use the word fundamentalism advisedly, that it becomes a kind of faith that you bang the table, you say free markets, free markets, free markets, but you don't actually examine, well, how are those markets working? And are they working in ways we want them to? And as you say, in the end of the book, we actually look at the evidence. So one of the things we argue is that the whole central argument about capitalism and freedom, that if you compromise capitalism even a little bit, you're on your way to totalitarian, it's just not true. We have 15 countries in Europe that are all more socialistic than the United States, that have better social safety networks, better regulation of workplace safety, in many cases, stricter environmental regulation. And they're prosperous, wealthy countries, Germany, France. They have their problems, of course, but their social safety networks have not led them into totalitarianism. So that basic argument, the basic road to serfdom, the slippery slope argument, has been shown by history to be false. And yet, I don't know, well, except for maybe you, but I mean, I don't know of any, libertarian who's come forward. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. We actually quote a couple in the books. There are some people who have made this point. But in general, many of the libertarian think tanks are still pitching Hayek, still pitching von Mises, as if these arguments had not been tested and shown to be false. And so as I've said already, I don't judge ideas simply on whether they're scientific or not. That's just one criteria. But if you have an idea that's been shown to be false, then if you're being rational, you should say, maybe we need to rethink that. And the other, to me, even more important point of the argument is about happiness. And if you think about, we go back to the Declaration of Independence and, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not the responsibility of government to make us happy, but it is the responsibility of government to try to maximize the conditions that allow us to pursue our happiness, whatever we think will make us happy. And if you look at any of the measures of happiness around the globe, the United States is not doing very well. We're actually doing quite poorly, and we're one of the most unhappy countries of any wealthy nation. And that tells us that we are doing something wrong. And therefore, we would do well to try to think about what it is that we're doing wrong and how we might be able to set it right. And again, it's not. I just had your colleague Mark Schultz on their book is The Good Life, about that longitudinal Harvard study that's been going on since 1938. And contrary to the idea of just pure individualism, in fact, the best thing you can do, better than not smoking, better than not drinking or drugs or risky sex and sports, is just have friends and have a social circle and family social
and
networks.
Love.
Right, exactly.
Right,
love, right. I mean, and I think it was the Beatles who said, money can't buy me love, right? Right, exactly. So those social networks, and we have very frayed social networks in the United States, in part because we've been all taught that it's about achievement, it's about money. We should move for work if we need to, or maybe our corporations will demand that we move for work. And so our social networks get frayed by, this very achievement, very driven, very money-oriented society that we have. And it doesn't make us happy, and it doesn't lead to a long life.
Yeah, well, actually, by the time I got old enough and I had a job and a house and a family, mortgage, kid in school, and so on, And then I realized this libertarian argument, well, just get up and move and leave if you don't like the state of California or you're not happy with this government. It's like, well, where am I going to go? I mean, this is my home. My kids in school, they've got friends here. I mean, come on.
Right. It's not realistic. And, we haven't talked a lot about Milton Friedman, and maybe that's okay because people probably know a lot about him. But this is one of the most pernicious things he says in Capitalism. He says, well, people can just move. But no, you can't just move. I mean, first of all, it costs money to move. It's not always easy to find another job. And there are real losses, real substantive losses that maybe don't show up on a balance sheet. But if you move away from your friends and families, you lose those important social networks. And there's a kind of almost reckless disregard for the significance of those things. And then, of course, the other thing that's really egregious about Friedman is he says this in relations to African Americans. Well, if they're not succeeding where they are, they could just move. Well, I mean, think about redlining. Think about discrimination in housing, which he defended. So did George Stigler. Think about Oregon, that for until the 20th century actually forbade Black people from moving to the state. So the idea that you can just pick up and move, that's just not the reality of the world we live in.
Yeah, much of it is almost like a sci-fi scenario. Imagine a planet.
Exactly. Exactly.
I like
Imagine a true democracy.
Epigram you have from Martin Luther King Jr. from a speech he gave at UCLA, April 27, 1965. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important. Do you think?
Yeah. I know.
Yeah.
I love that quotation.
Because libertarians will make the argument, well, slavery would have fallen into disuse. We didn't need the Civil War. I don't think so. I think oftentimes you have to just make people do like integrating schools.
Right.
The governor of Arkansas.
Right? Arkansas. Little Rock.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And the president said, no, this is the law of the land. And it was
the federal government that protected the freedom of those children to go to school. And that was Dwight Eisenhower, who I feel that writing this book has made me a great hero of Dwight Eisenhower, who I think is a bit of an unsung hero.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, totally. We're sending men with guns to make you do. This is just the way it is, right? And sometimes
and to protect the freedom of those individuals, right? Because the point is, again, we get back to the competing freedoms. White supremacists wanted to have the freedom to exclude Black children from school, and Black children wanted to have the freedom to go to school. Right.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. You can't have everything. There's often conflicting rights. That's just the way it goes. Somebody has to make the decision. Yeah. I like the Eisenhower's, military-industrial complex speech. Wow. Was that ever been turned out to be prophetic? And he's a Republican.
I know.
And a military man.
I know.
Right?
Well, I always feel like because he was a general, he could see through the false promises of the military contractors, right? Whereas I think people who haven't served in the military, and I mean, myself included, but I think it's easier to fall for the hype of contractors when they promise you some shiny new weapon. Whereas if you actually had to fight a war, then maybe you're a bit more pragmatic
just
about
that shooting down that Chinese spy balloon. Then the other object that they tried to shoot down and missed, the missile was $450,000. I mean, it's like, what?
Right.
It's just astonishing.
It is.
I don't know if you read Fred Kaplan's book, The Bomb, but he shows that the real arms race was not just between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between the three departments in the military.
Oh, yes.
Right? This is the reason we have the triad, the nuclear triad, because the Army said, well, we want one. And Navy says, well, we want one, because you get more money. Your budget goes up, you get more contracting contracts and so on. It's like, okay.
Well, yeah, this is slightly off point, but my book, Science and a Mission, is largely just that's a big part of my story, because oceanography becomes the beneficiary of that, because the Navy is determined not to allow itself to become obsolete in the face of nuclear weapons. The Air Force, basically, at the end of World War II, is basically saying, who needs a Navy anymore? We'll drop atomic bombs from planes. End of story. And the Navy says, no, we'll put nuclear weapons on submarines. And then there's a whole world of science that needs to develop about the ocean environment. So it's good for science, whether it's good for global politics or the American taxpayers, a different story.
Right.
We should try to wrap up because I have a few other things I have to do this afternoon.
Okay, so just on a big picture. So despite the massive influence that the big myth has had in the last century, we have child protection laws and labor laws and workmen's compensation. And, life is way better for average people. How did this happen? Apparently the liberals did do something. to get around this.
Exactly. Well, it happened because people fought, right? I mean, all of these wins were bitterly fought. So yes, we did get laws prohibiting child labor. We did get workmen's compensation, but people had to really fight for them. And part of our argument is that a lot of those gains have been rolled back in the last 40 years, really since Ronald Reagan, and even to some extent, Jimmy Carter. We try to be nonpartisan in that respect. There have been a lot of losses in recent decades, and I was astonished to read just the other day, there are Republicans across this country now trying to roll back child labor law, which again,
Really?
I know, that would have been a good epilogue to the book too. I was like, really? Child labor? You really, so this is a thing. And so we see this across the country. Many of the gains, many of the advances are being threatened. And part of the way they get threatened is through the ideology, to say government programs don't work, government programs are wasteful, it's abusive, or of course the whole fight over COVID-19 mask mandates and all of that. So we need public health, we need science, we need so many of the things that, again, I can't do my own. I mean, I'm trained as a scientist, but scientists don't just do science on their own. They do science as part of an enterprise that's funded mostly by the federal government. And there are all these things that I think people, I guess our argument is that we need to stand up for governance as our tool, right? I mean, go back to the we the people thing, right? The whole notion that the founding fathers put forward was that government was the instrument of the will of the people. And I think we've lost sight of that in part because of the propagandizing myth that we talk about in this book.
Yeah. Well, I'm recommending this to everybody to read, especially libertarians, conservatives, classical liberals, whatever the term is people are using these days.
I know. If you notice, we're very careful using the word neoliberal because it's really hard to know what that means. So we try to use it only for people who call themselves that, like von Hayek. But that's great because that's, of course, who we most want to read the book. We don't want to just preach to the choir, although I think liberals or progressives or Democrats or whatever you want to call them, they have a lot to learn too, because I think the right wing, the pro-market forces, the libertarians have really controlled the narrative to a great extent since Ronald Reagan. And even if they haven't won all the battles that they wanted to win, they've won a big part of the battle of our thinking, so that even progressives, will feel like they can't defend government or they can't defend government programs. Now, I think this has changed a little bit with Biden, especially with him pushing back just the other day about Social Security, because there are a lot of Republicans who have been going after Social Security. They went after Social Security under Ronald Reagan. They went after it under George W., and they're going after it again because of the ideological commitment to being opposed to, quote, big government. But the program works. And so liberals, progressives, Democrats, whatever you want to call yourself, should stand up and say, Social Security works. It's a great program. We're proud of it. Need to adjust it every now and again, like we say in the book. I mean, the first time Social Security got in trouble was in the 1980s. It was 50 years old. And now that I'm past 50, I can say all 50-year-old things need maintenance.
That's funny. Yeah. But even Biden and the Dems in general don't want to cut back on military spending. And why is that? I guess, do they really buy the threat, that it's coming and we have to protect ourselves? Or is it just we can't get elected? It's like Social Security, Medicare for Republicans. They got to support it because, that's a third rail. Maybe it's something like that.
Well, I don't know. I'm a registered independent and I don't have access to the inner workings of the Biden administration. But it is my impression that it's something along the lines of what you said, that Democrats are just petrified that if they try to confront the military beast, it's a sacred cow, right? And that'll be politically, suicide for them. So maybe there would be some kind of bipartisan compromise where Democrats and Republicans could be honest about the military and Social Security. Except the problem is that I think Social Security, it's not even tax. You talk about it being money well spent, but of course that's the other lie that gets told about Social Security, right? That it's this giant drain on the federal budget, but it's not, because it's a program that pays for itself through the Social Security payroll tax. So, anyway.
Well, yes, what caused me to change my mind is because my commitment is to whatever's true, not any particular position or ideology. This is the problem. People get themselves, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I'm Catholic, I'm whatever. Right. I'm an atheist, so I have to believe these things. That's always going to be a problem.
Right. Well, that's why I think you and I can be friends, because I feel the same way. And it's also about revising your views in light of new evidence, right?
Yeah.
And that's I feel like that's the most powerful thing I learned as a scientist, since that's my original training. What is science really all about? It's about looking at the data, looking at the evidence, and changing your mind in the face of new evidence. And that should be the case in politics as well. But once you get locked into an ideological position, then it becomes very hard. And then if you're also being propagandized by people with a vested interest who are hiding the fact that it's propaganda, you're listening to a radio program thinking it's entertainment and not knowing that it's actually propaganda from American manufacturers, then it's very hard to make good decisions because you're not getting good information. And that's, of course, the other irony that, Erik and I always like to praise. If you think about Adam Smith, what is the centerpiece of his argument? People can make those self-interested choices if they have good information, right?
Right.
But if you don't have good information, then the whole notion of a competitive marketplace falls apart.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, that's what your book does. It provides good information about the history of where these ideas came from, and that's important. And also, ideas matter. This is my world. I mean, it's everything. People act on what they believe is true.
Exactly.
And if what they believe is true is actually false, well, then we have a problem.
Exactly. I couldn't have said that better myself. I think that's a really great summary.
Good place to end. All right. Thanks, Naomi.